At exactly 5:45 on May 26, 2025, a Ukrainian Air Force pilot cinched down his harness inside the cockpit of a MiG-29 that should have been grounded years ago. Its metal was Soviet, its bones Cold War relics, but today, it carried a payload its designers never dreamed of. Bolted beneath each wing, French precision-guided bombs. Navigated via American GPS delivered using a cracked iPad, jury-rig software, and a battlefield miracle stitched together with zip ties and caffeine. He sat motionless for a breath. Then the canopy came down. The weight of what he was about to do pressed harder than the G-forces he'd soon endure. Because this wasn't just a strike, it was a message. No one had ever hit the FSB in this war. Russia's Federal Security Service was supposed to be untouchable. A fortress wrapped in layers of classified shielding and decades of fear. But that illusion was about to end. The mission profile bordered on insanity. Fly nap of the Earth for nearly 100 kilometers, skimming the wheat fields to stay invisible. Then pull straight up, 5,000 meters in under 30 seconds, and hurl the bombs in a Cold War-style toss that would light up every radar from Belgorod to Moscow. He'd have 20 seconds, maybe less, before Russia's air defense network fired back. If he was still alive by then, it would be a miracle. At 5:58, he advanced the throttles. Twin Klimov Art-33 turbofans screamed to life, spitting fire and 18,000 pounds of thrust. The MiG-29 surged forward, claws gripping the runway like a beast waking from a long sleep. A shadow flickered across the hangars behind him. Then the jet roared skyward, French engineering, American satellites, and raw Ukrainian defiance hurtling into the dawn. At 6:15, the MiG carved through the Ukrainian countryside at just 50 meters altitude. So low, its jet wash bent the wheat stalks and panicked flocks of birds exploded into the sky. Flying this low was more art than science. Every second required full attention, dodging power lines, grazing rooftops, ducking behind tree lines. But it was the only way to stay invisible to the hungry radars watching from just across the border. The margins were razor thin. One wrong twitch, and he'd be a fireball in a farm field. But the Earth itself was his ally. At this altitude, the Russian S-400 systems, capable of tracking targets from 400 kilometers, couldn't see a damn thing beyond 25 kilometers. As long as he stayed this low, stayed this fast, he was a ghost. But in 3 minutes, he would have to rise from the dead. Because to deliver the payload, he'd have to climb. Right into their kill zone. With Frankenstein tech duct taped together by Ukrainian engineers who never took impossible for an answer. The coordinates glowed on his iPad, yes, an actual iPad, duct taped to the dashboard like some black market fighter jet HUD. The target, FSB headquarters in Glovo, just 5 miles from the Ukrainian border. This wasn't a warehouse. This wasn't an ammo dump. This was Putin's old crew, the heirs to the KGB, the ones who trained the men who orchestrated assassinations and hacked elections. The heart of Russia's security elite. They didn't expect anyone to be crazy enough to come for them. They were about to be proven wrong. Hanging under the wings were 2 AASM Hammer bombs. French masterpieces. Smart bombs with dumb parents, Soviet avionics from the 1980s. A marriage that never should have worked. The MiG's ancient brain didn't even understand the concept of GPS, let alone interface with a weapon that cost more than most Ukrainian homes. But Ukrainian engineers weren't in the business of asking for permission. They built custom pylons in garages and warzone machine shops. Wired up GPS antennas to the forward hardpoints. Ran power cables through access panels that had no business being open. Fed French guidance packages with Soviet voltage and pure stubbornness. Each AASM Hammer was a symphony of technology, 250 kilograms, guided by a hybrid of inertial navigation and military GPS, capable of hitting a specific window from 70 kilometers away. A solid fuel rocket motor in the tail gave the bomb thrust after release, propelling it faster than most fighters fly, straight at its target. But none of that mattered unless the MiG could tell the bombs where to go. That's where the iPad came in. Running handmade software, it translated modern targeting coordinates into something the bombs could understand. A digital Rosetta Stone taped to a Soviet dashboard. It was ugly. It was untested. And it was about to be the sharpest blade Ukraine had ever thrown. At 6:22, he hit the initial point. The MiG surged upward in a sudden, brutal climb. The G-forces pinned him to his seat. The altimeter spun like a roulette wheel, 1,000 meters, 2,000, 3,000. Radar warning receivers screamed to life. Every Russian eye now turned toward a single dot on a screen. The S-400 battery southeast of Belgorod locked on, its 92 and 6 gravestone radar sweeping his MiG, calculating vectors, speed, altitude. The fire control system was seconds away from a solution. But they hadn't counted on madness. And madness had wings today. At 5,000 meters, the iPad blinked, optimal launch. His thumb dropped. Thunk, thunk. Both bombs fell away. He rolled the MiG inverted and yanked hard, executing a turn so violent it would have made a World War I pilot proud. Nose down. Speed up. Dive like a hawk returning to the treetops, racing gravity itself. Behind him, the bombs ignited. The rocket motors flared, pushing each ASM into a near-supersonic glide path. The GPS receivers locked in. The inertial systems checked every wobble. The bombs were flying themselves now, silent assassins from the sky. The maneuver he just performed was old-school, toss bombing. Developed during the Cold War to lob nuclear bombs without flying directly over the target. Crazy then. Suicidal now. But maybe, just maybe, that's what would make it work. 2 Russian 48N6 missiles burst from their launchers like volcanic fury. But the MiG was already gone. Back to hugging the earth, weaving through radar shadows like a phantom. The missiles flew blind, looking for a bomber. They found only sky. The bombs had less than 2 minutes before impact. And inside Glovo, the FSB still thought the morning was quiet. At 6:25 a.m., the 2 AASM Hammer bombs were halfway through their arc, silent, nearly invisible, streaking through the upper atmosphere like twin comets aimed at a single target. Their guidance systems were now in full control. Each bomb, a 250-kilogram slab of engineered fury, was making hundreds of microscopic corrections per second. Military-grade GPS, backed by inertial navigation, plotted their trajectory with surgical precision. Even if Russia jammed the satellite signal, which they often did, the bombs could still reach their target using only onboard gyroscopes and physics older than Sputnik. This wasn't just falling with style. This was guided vengeance at Mach 0.8, launched from the mind of a Ukrainian engineer with a soldering iron and a grudge. Each bomb was 3 weapons in one. At the nose, a fusion of ring laser gyros and hardened GPS receivers that could guide through a jammed battlefield. At the core, a solid-fuel rocket motor that had already ignited after release, boosting speed and range far beyond gravity's natural pull. And at the tail, sophisticated control surfaces that could steer the bomb like a miniature cruise missile, adjusting 50 times per second, even banking midair to hit targets from unexpected angles. As the 2 weapons approached their final dive, onboard computers calculated a maneuver no human could improvise. The software ran predictive models in real time, adjusting for wind speed, angle of impact, even the elevation of the building's rooftop HVAC units. The target, FSB headquarters, Glovo, Belgorod Oblast. A brutalist structure of Soviet concrete and thick security, designed to withstand car bombs and riots, not a precision-guided strike from 8,000 meters above. No one inside had any idea what was coming. But above them, the morning sky was about to tear open. At 6 hours 26 minutes and 45 seconds. At a radar station 40 kilometers northeast of the impact zone, Senior Lieutenant Smirnov was halfway through his 3rd cup of morning tea when the S-400's long-range radar pinged an alert. 2 objects, small, fast and falling, were visible. Climbing? Diving. And not fighters. Not missiles either. Something else. The system flagged them as unidentified ballistic objects. That was unusual. Alarming. In under 45 seconds, he had to react. The S-400 Triumph system was supposed to be the jewel of Russian air defense, a web of sensors, radars, launchers, and interceptors capable of vaporizing threats from space or sea. But sophistication had a cost. The system was built for planes, drones, cruise missiles, even hypersonics. Not for small, falling bombs in a near-vertical plunge. Everything about these objects was wrong. Their radar cross-section was minimal. Their trajectory steep. Their approach silent. And worst of all, their timing. By the time the fire control radar locked in, the bombs were already inside the final engagement envelope. Still, orders were orders. 2 48N6 missiles screamed from their launchers at Mach 6, aimed at intercepting the intruders. But the angles were impossible. The bombs were already descending at near supersonic speed with their own rocket-assisted dive. The 48N6s were optimized to knock down airborne bombers, not hit a moving brick in a deadfall. The fire control computers spat out an ugly number, 12% intercept probability. The radar operators swore. But it was already too late. At 6 hours 27 minutes and 3 seconds, the first AASM's radar proximity fuse detected the rooftop beneath it. The algorithm calculated its exact impact speed, 250 meters per second. The fuse armed itself and began a countdown, 0.025 seconds to detonation after impact. No more. No less. The bomb struck the roof of the FSB building dead center, angled slightly to maximize penetration. The shaped charge in the warhead activated instantly, creating a molten jet of copper that sliced through the building's superstructure like a lightsaber through ice. Steel beams turned to slag. Concrete evaporated. Office floors that had once held interrogations and data servers were split open like rotten fruit. 0.3 seconds later, the second bomb struck 20 meters away. By that point, the building was already starting to collapse from within, its internal bones shattered, its foundations compromised. The second blast sealed its fate. What followed was something engineers call progressive collapse. First, the fourth floor gave out and slammed into the third. Then the fifth followed, adding its mass and speed to the destruction. Every floor stacked like a domino tipped by gravity and detonated by mathematics. Filing cabinets were atomized. Classified files turned into burning ash that rained down across the block. Chairs and desks became high-speed shrapnel. The force of the explosions created a reflected overpressure wave, an internal shock wave that bounced between floors, amplifying its own power. The pressure reached 200 psi inside the sealed structure, enough to pulp human bodies in milliseconds. Windows didn't shatter. They exploded outward, flinging jagged glass across the street. Fragments were later found embedded in walls 300 meters away. The last security camera feed blinked out mid-frame, just a white flash and then black. By 6 hours 27 minutes and 9 seconds, a 5-story symbol of Russian state power had been erased from the map. Gone in 6 seconds. A building designed to hold secrets was now a smoldering crater. And the man who destroyed it? Already vanishing over the horizon, low, fast, and smiling grimly beneath his oxygen mask. By the time the smoke stopped rising above Glovo, the war had already changed. Russia's elite didn't know it yet. But the truth was burning right in front of them, smoldering in the rubble where the FSB headquarters used to stand. This wasn't just a building. It was the building. The nerve center of counterintelligence for Belgorod Oblast. Offices stacked with agents, surveillance experts, cyber analysts, field coordinators, people who thought they were safe because they'd always been safe. For decades, this facility had coordinated operations across Ukraine's eastern frontier. And in under 10 seconds, it was turned to dust by 2 French bombs launched from a Soviet jet flown by a pilot who never should have survived the mission. The message wasn't subtle. It was a middle finger wrapped in 500 kilograms of explosives and delivered with absolute precision. Ukraine had just crossed a line no one dared even sketch in the sand. They hadn't struck some tactical outpost or radar array. They had walked into the lion's den, looked Putin's legacy dead in the eyes, and blown it to hell. Inside the Russian Ministry of Defense, phones rang like alarms. Satellite footage arrived within hours. Thermal scans confirmed a total loss. There were no survivors in the Central Command wing. The encrypted archives? Gone. Years of operations, blacklists, data trails, obliterated. The S-400 crews had failed. The radar operators were interrogated. The entire Western District Air Defense Command was put on emergency alert. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. They had been caught flat-footed by an idea no algorithm could predict. Audacity. Because this wasn't just a high-risk mission. It was something deeper. Something colder. Ukraine had used everything in its toolbox. NATO technology, Soviet leftovers, improvised engineering, and wrapped it around a core of raw nerve. The psychological impact was devastating. For months, Russian intelligence operatives had worked under the illusion of geographic immunity. The belief that no one would dare, or could, touch them. But that veil had been torn in half, and the rip went straight to the top. Putin's own former agency, the FSB, now carried the stain of vulnerability. By 10 a.m., emergency briefings were underway in Moscow. Kremlin advisors debated whether to retaliate publicly or let the news drip out slowly, controlling the damage. But it was too late for that. The internet had already lit up. Amateur drone footage showed plumes of black smoke rising over Glovo. Telegram channels pulsed with rumors. Ukrainian officials said nothing, but everyone knew exactly who was responsible. The strike had no official claim, no press conference, no TikTok bravado. Just silence. As if Ukraine had said, if you know, you know. And Russia knew. In Kiev, military commanders huddled over satellite imagery and telemetry. The mission had gone better than any simulation. The bombs had hit within 5 meters of their designated impact points. The MiG had returned safely. The pilot, his name still classified, walked away uninjured. His only visible wound, a shallow gash across his knuckles from when the throttle had snapped back too hard during the dive. They gave him a quiet medal that afternoon. No parade. No cameras. Just a handshake. And a new call sign, Spectre. Because that's what he'd become. A ghost. A whisper in enemy airspace. Proof that even outdated hardware, when paired with the right mind, could become a scalpel sharp enough to cut out the heart of an empire. Across NATO listening posts, analysts scrambled to adjust their models. Ukraine had just rewritten the doctrine for asymmetric warfare. Not with hypersonics. Not with stealth bombers. But with a Frankenstein warplane, a hacked tablet, and sheer willpower. In war rooms from Berlin to Washington, generals leaned forward in their chairs. If Ukraine could do this with scraps and software, what else were they capable of? By the end of that same day, what had begun as a single strike by a single fighter jet had triggered a diplomatic thunderclap. In Moscow, Kremlin officials scrambled to maintain the illusion of control. State news channels downplayed the Glovo blast as a localized explosion. But even their most hardened anchors couldn't hide the live images now circulating on every encrypted app and foreign outlet. The collapsed FSB headquarters, windows blown out in surrounding buildings, body bags being loaded into black trucks under tarps. Putin remained silent. But behind closed doors, the gloves came off. Within 12 hours, Russia launched a wave of retaliatory missile strikes. Over 40 caliber and Iskander-class projectiles fired into Ukraine's east. They targeted infrastructure, power stations, bridges. A symbolic show of strength. But none of them hit a military target. None of them stopped the damage already done. Because the real damage wasn't measured in concrete or craters. It was measured in doubt. The strike on Glovo didn't just humiliate Russia's most secretive agency. It cracked the myth of invincibility that had protected its entire command structure. Intelligence officers across the western oblasts stopped sleeping in the same bed 2 nights in a row. Entire regional offices began shifting operations underground. Generals moved meetings to bunkers. Laptop bans were issued. Cell phones were stripped. It was like someone had turned on the lights in a room full of thieves. Ukraine had done what seemed impossible. It had made the watchers feel watched. In Paris, the strike triggered a quiet crisis. AASM Hammer bombs that had shattered Glovo were French. The MiG-29s? Ukrainian. The GPS satellites? American. But none of it officially connected. Still, the message was clear. NATO tech had just rewritten Soviet doctrine. A senior NATO official speaking off the record put it bluntly. They didn't ask permission. They didn't wait for consensus. They just rewired the Cold War's dead hardware and punched Russia in the face with it. In Washington, the Pentagon offered no comment. But inside classified briefings, officials pored over logs of the mission. How the iPad interface had worked. How the GPS corrections were handled mid-flight. One general called it digital judo, using the weight of Russia's expectations against them. Even China took notice. State-backed defense forums exploded with speculation. Was this the future of warfare? Where battlefield supremacy didn't belong to whoever had the best jets, but whoever had the best coders. Back in Ukraine, Spectre, the pilot, returned to a temporary base on the outskirts of Kharkiv. No fanfare. No interviews. He had already changed out of his flight suit and was sitting silently in a folding chair beside the refueling crew when a junior technician approached him and said, "Sir, you just blew up the KGB." Spectre didn't smile. Just nodded once and replied, "Not all of it." Because he knew the truth. This wasn't a climax. It was a signal. A declaration. A prototype mission that proved what Ukraine had become, more than just a nation fighting for survival. They were now an engineering nation, a war-forging machine, fusing East and West, past and future, into battlefield instruments no textbook had prepared for. What came next, no one could predict. But the days of fighting by the old rules? They were over. In the weeks that followed the destruction of the FSB headquarters in Glovo, Russia's intelligence network didn't just go silent, it fractured. Field agents stopped sending routine reports. Secure lines went dead. Paranoia spread faster than any Ukrainian drone. After all, if they could hit Glovo, what else was on the table? The FSB began rerouting communications through backup channels not touched since the Cold War. Paper-only protocols returned. Meetings were held face-to-face in hotel rooms, without phones, under the hum of air conditioners to muffle sound. Trust, the very currency of any spy agency, had evaporated in a single detonation. Behind closed doors, Putin was furious. Not just at Ukraine. Not just at the West. But at the terrifying truth. His enemies had stopped playing by the rules. And worse? His own people didn't know how to adapt. The S-400 air defense system, once hailed as the crown jewel of Russia's military-industrial complex, now had a black mark on its record. Not just for failing to stop the MiG, but for being conceptually outmaneuvered. Its greatest strength, precision engagement of known threats, had become its Achilles heel. It wasn't designed for creativity. And Ukraine had weaponized exactly that. In defense academies around the world, the Glovo strike became a case study overnight. Not because it involved new tech, but because it didn't. There was no stealth bomber. No hypersonic missile. Just a 40-year-old MiG, duct tape, and an iPad. That's what made it terrifying. That's what made it replicable. Military strategists in NATO called it Frankenstein warfare, the rapid assembly of mismatched parts to create one-time use weapons tailored for specific missions. No doctrine. No handbook. Just problems solved in real time by engineers, hackers, and pilots willing to push the limits of physics and sanity. And as for Ukraine, they didn't celebrate. They iterated. Workshops in Kiev and Lviv began quietly building more interface modules for the AASM. Retired jets were pulled from storage. Software teams updated targeting tools. Every mission log from the Glovo strike was studied, dissected, improved. Spectre's flight path became standard reading for new fighter recruits. His maneuver, the climb, release, dive, was nicknamed the Spectre toss. But the biggest shift came from the mindset. Ukraine had proven something few militaries had, that speed, improvisation, and brains could beat numbers, systems, and scale. That you didn't need to match your enemy's weapons, you just needed to outthink them. And so, by the time Russia replaced the fallen Glovo headquarters with a new command center, this time, buried deep underground, Ukraine had already moved on. Because the real battlefield was no longer just geography. It was imagination. And that day in May, imagination flew at treetop height, climbed into enemy airspace, released its payload, and vanished into the wheat fields, leaving behind nothing but debris, silence, and the unmistakable sound of the future.